Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we discuss the movie Grosse Point Blank 1 minute at a time. I am your co-host, Hugh David.
And I'm Dev, and on today's show, we're going to be looking at minute 14. And in minute 14, we have Alan Arkin and John Cusack playing Martin Blank, and Alan Arkin playing Dr. Oatman, going through Martin's therapy session and really discussing why maybe this shouldn't be happening as a therapy session.
And joining us today, our guest, as in the last couple of episodes, is fellow Movies by Minute podcaster David Forsyth. How are you, sir?
Doing excellent. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. It's great to have you on. Wonderful to have your experience as well as your perspective on this film. So, quick question before we carry on. David, did you see this film when it first hit theatrical, or was it a home video viewing?
I definitely saw it in the theater. I remember very distinctly because the film melted right in the midst of the conversation on the hill with Dan Aykroyd.
No way.
Yeah. So they restored it fairly quickly, like maybe 10, 15 minutes later.
Yeah.
But it was memorable because my friend John, who was a notorious cheapskate, used that to get our money back for the viewing. They were like, no, you saw the whole movie. We repaired it. And he's like, yeah, but we missed like a minute of the introduction of one of the main characters of the movie. And so they gave us like passes for another free movie. So
that worked. Wow.
Yeah, that worked. Yeah.
Wow.
So I think it was here in America, the theaters are run by teenagers essentially.
Right.
So just a little bit of bullying usually gets you what you want. From
right.
Them, so.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very different here.
Yeah.
So this scene that we're in, last episode we were talking about Alan Arkin, the wonderful late great Alan Arkin, and the sort of the various elements of cinema that draws us into, as well as the history of spy fiction and hitman. This moment here, this minute that we're now entering, is one of the bits where I find absolutely fascinating because we understand why Martin has chosen this particular person to talk to, as opposed to just any other. Why is this bizarre hostage situation of an interview going on? And I don't think it could be any more meta, funny, 90s,
Yeah.
because I read your books. I'm a fan, kind of thing. That whole attitude is just priceless.
Annihilation of Death and Kill Who, A Warrior's Dilemma, right?
Yeah,
just the best titles.
It sort of gives credence to when we were talking earlier about how Joan Cusack's character came to be in his employ, that it was deliberate choice, because this clearly from that revelation is a deliberate choice. He didn't just go to the neighborhood psychologist or find one in the yellow pages or whatever. He picked this person because he felt they had some insight into what he is going through, which that's probably a good way to pick a psychologist. The rest of their relationship needs some work, but yeah, I think that's it's astute to it's another insight into his character, right? Like, he clearly is a planner, someone who likes to do some research, and we hear him just in our first minute today. So I guess that was 11, where he talks about, no, I need my normal lead time, but then gives up on that very quickly to sort of show you what yes, he's a planner, but he's clearly out of his element right now, right? Like he's not in his normal ways.
Yep.
This is also the point where we finally get the intro for the romantic part of this film, the rom-com. We finally hear the name Debi.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, it's precisely because Martin doesn't want to talk about the thing that he does for a living, even though in the most wonderful way, because you were saying the other episode, David, where Arkin's restrained exasperation, the way he says, I'd just like to put it out there that maybe killing lots of people is maybe the source of why you're feeling this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Cusack Blank is like, no, no, it's fine. That bit's not the issue.
Yeah.
And there's a weird way you can sort of understand that, right? Because to him, the job is black and white, right?
Yeah.
You know, someone's hired me to kill you. There's probably a reason why, as he says, you know, there's I show up at your door. There's a reason why I'm there. Is the line of dialogue. But actually, you can see how that makes it easier for him.
Yeah, and I think that's clearly a linchpin for him, because that's a theme
Mm.
that we circle back to later on
Mm.
in kind of the end of the film. That's definitely a tenet that he's held very dear to him, and I think that's probably something that was instilled into him through his time in the forces as effectively a government sanctioned gun for hire, right?
Mm.
To kind of train them into what it was that they needed to do. And I think a lot of this movie is him deprogramming himself of that.
Ooh, that's a good way to look at it. I like that idea, the deprogramming of how you've been trained. Again, something that was in the air at the time. One of my favorite lines from one of my all-time favorite movies is, and I'm as obsessed with that movie as you are with this one, Dev, is Manhunter by Michael Mann, and the book it's based on, Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. And there's a line of dialogue in the film that actually has gone in and out of various home video cuts depending on Mann's mood, in which the lead character, who's an FBI profiler, explains that he has sympathy for the child that the serial killer was, because, as he put it, somebody took that child and manufactured a monster.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, the fact that I feel that way doesn't stop me from wanting to blow the sick F out of his socks, you know. And it's that interesting dichotomy of, you know, as a law enforcer, he knows what his job is and he's clear on what it needs to be. And any sympathies he has for the person he's chasing down are irrelevant in that context. And this is almost like the flip side of that.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of someone manufacturing monsters, this is somebody who went out and volunteered to become a person who's sanctioned to kill and became so good at it that he's now privatized himself in that role.
Right.
But it still has consequences. It still has things he has to deal with, and he has to admit to that and get to grips with that, because he won't admit to it here. He's like, the bit where he sits there and goes, well, you know, what do we do now? What do we talk about? Like, you know, like, well, dude, you literally want to ignore the thing that actually matters here. You know, the expert you asked has just told you what you should be talking about. And he's like, nah, you know, let's talk about something else. Like, bro, man, like, if I, you know, you can just the sheer, like, if Blank wasn't actually someone taking you hostage, the sheer, I mean, it's beyond exasperation. You know, at that point, as Arkin's character, you must be like, just, oh god, fine, just give me the money. Let's just do this. You know, your traditional vision of what this should be. You know, I'm amazed Cusack doesn't almost lie down on the sofa at that point. You know,
I think, especially considering when we're recording this, so, you know, we're recording this the weekend of Veterans Day in the United States. It's Armistice Day in the UK, but I think this is in some ways a telling insight into some of the issues that people coming out of the services can face in re-entering the real world, and that sense that they need to deprogram themselves of the training, because a lot of the things that are required and effective for service are not helpful for civilian life. And I think that can be a very, very challenging thing. And we see, you know, I think some improvements have been made in that regard, but I think this film is kind of, you know, right at that point where this was really getting a lot more mainstream attention, right, from, you know, Vietnam veterans re-entering the civilian world, happening, you know, kind of 10 to 20 years prior. And at this point, Gulf War veterans re-entering civilian life, with, you know, maybe a little bit more acceptance of things such as PTSD and traumas that have been realized during service and in campaigns. And it's a difficult topic and a difficult thing to speak to, and it obviously that's not really the tone of this movie to address those in depth, but I think it's interesting that Martin Blanc is clearly aware of that, right? Is clearly going to a psychiatrist that specializes in that based on the titles of the books, right? It's very much the sound of psychiatrist and psychologist. I feel like we're using the terms interchangeably, but Dr. Oatman is very clearly specializing in people who have come out of the services, who have faced those things and are traumatized by them.
And I think there was a shift around this time, because if you think about movies that kind of dealt with it, like First Blood and Rambo, right? Like that character is clearly set up as someone who, what else am I supposed to do? Kind of like that's all he knew, and he had this trauma, and that's Vietnam era, right? So like people who had this inflicted upon them because there was a draft, and the Vietnam was seen as a much more controversial and unjust thing, especially at the time than Gulf War stuff was. Retrospect on the Gulf War may have proven how it was perhaps a bit more unjust, but whatever. That's that's a whole different podcast. So I think there was a bit of a shift in how we were looking at the trauma we did to veterans around this time as well. So I think that's astute. Yeah.
I mean, this is the Gen X version.
Yeah.
Lots of humor, lots of talking, lots of music.
Yeah.
Rather than the guy in the wilderness. I mean, don't get me wrong. First Blood is still really quite something as a film. And it's the only one of that series that can be called realistic in any sense of the word. Yeah. But yeah, as you say, there was that period, wasn't there? Late 70s, Deer Hunter, First Blood, all of those films, and then Rolling Thunder, Taxi Driver, and then that's one way of dealing with it. Then we have this way of dealing with it, which is, as Dev said in a previous episode, entrepreneurial. I've turned into a business now, and I'm the guy who goes out and gets it done, and you pay me, and this is what I do, and it's not that big a deal, and it's all talk, and as well, it's kind of.
And it's almost become a trope at this point of this in this film, right? Like he doesn't really have to explain it, right? Like when he says, "I went into the army, I did some stuff, now I'm a hitman." Like that's his long version of the explanation that he gives a few times during this movie, and it's just sort of an accepted boom, boom, boom progression. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like no, it doesn't, but
yeah,
that's
true.
yeah. So it's that's sort of where that sits, and yeah.
This suddenly became a very heavy episode.
Well, that's the fun of the film.
And we are at the psychologist's office.
That's true. Do we want to speak a little bit to what the original script had on this one?
Please go. No, you take the lead. You were the one who dug out the scene.
Yeah. So as we've been going through these minutes, I've kind of had half an eye on a script that Hugh unearthed, which is fourth draft of the script. So probably not what they were actually shooting to, especially as there's quite a lot of substantive scene changes. But it's close enough that we can definitely find, rough matches for what's going on. And interestingly, particularly the characterization of Dr. Oatman in the script is very, very different to what we see on screen. We spoke yesterday about how he was dressed quite formally, and how this harkened back to that kind of film noir aesthetic and the early Freudian psychiatry. And actually, in the original script, there is a description of Dr. Oatman that is about as far cry from that as you can get. With I'll read this section out. Dr. Oatman sits in the window. He is Kris Kringle-esque and wears a sheepskin vest, rough-hewn shirt, faded Levi's, and old Fry boots. Oatman nods with the suave understanding of a man happy to collect 50,000 in fees before asking a tough question. And the entire scene actually plays out with this very different dynamic of a much more confident, assertive Oatman that's not really cowed by Martin Blanc's role or career choice. and inserts a couple of kind of flashbacks, which we've talked previously about how one of the things that I love about this movie is that there aren't these unnecessary flashbacks. You never see Martin as a teenager. You never see that moment when he decides to go and join the army. You never see him in the Gulf or in Burma or in Panama killing the president with a fork or any one of these other things. And these POVs aren't even referenced in the final version of the film. There's one which is in a crowded gymnasium and reminds me a little bit of the flashback in Kindergarten Cop, only the way it's described, significantly more violent. And another scene in a church, which is bare steps short of a full-on acid trip, as far as I can tell. It feels like a very different film suddenly.
Yeah. And I do wonder, because this draft is not the Tom Jankowicz's first, the original script. This is the one that Cusack and his two mates, who then became producers of the film, rewrote themselves. So this is their sense of humor. We're seeing what they've added to the film. And then, of course, Armitage will come in, and according to the interviews we've found with him online, he said that he looked at the script and said, well, this is great, but it's too long. You're going to have to cut it back. And they went away, tried to rewrite it, and ended up with an even longer script. So, which he said was something like 120 minutes or 150. And he was like, yeah, no, we're just going to have to. He said, look, let's just cut this down, shoot this, shoot that. We can cut this that way. So I do wonder if Armitage is the reason all the flashbacks went, for starters, but also what that then does for the tone. Because without them, it's down to our imagination, and it's down to the acting and their faces, and that's that's cinema. That's much more interesting than the literalism of saying, "Look, here is the vision, the Carrie-esque vision of a, body-strewn reunion." It's way more interesting this way, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think these are decisions that definitely benefit the film and give the viewer license to have some creative ownership of it as well, in a way that just does not exist in a lot of movies these days, where everything is explained and your baby stepped through it. So
yeah,
I appreciate it. Although I do kind of want to see this church sequence, because
do you know what?
Yeah,
I feel like this is the sort of that version of it is the sort of thing Matthew Vaughn was trying with the Kingsman films. I feel like that's it's a Mark Miller comic book style take on things. Extreme violence for laughter's sake, as opposed to what we get now, which is something much more interior, much more psychological.
And I think this movie sort of benefits from straddling that line of realism and not quite, right. Like there's a lot of things that are sort of like fanciful ideas, like the fact that there's a very local radio station to Grosse Point where there's just a lady who is well known. Like there's small things that are sort of real and possible, but sort of out of step with reality, like with how things in modern culture work. And I think not having those flashbacks helps preserve some of that feeling to this movie, and I think it does it service to do that.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like the writing at this stage in the drafting is a little bit of some teenagers throwing everything at the wall, and
Yeah.
in goes the kitchen sink.
Yeah, and then our message comes along. By that point, what, 17, 20 years in the business, and he sort of says, yeah, okay, guys, love, this is your first attempt at all of this. Now let's do this, and I think, again, that's what makes it work.
I forget exactly who it was, but one of the guests on our show brought up the concept of, a film, a movie can burn through ideas so quickly. Like you can cram, hundreds, dozens of ideas into a script, and depending on how it's shot, that can make you 2 minutes of film, or that can make
Yeah.
you 120 minutes of film. And so sometimes you just need to throw all the ideas in there and
Yes.
and sort of see how it gels out. And sometimes that comes out in the script, sometimes that gets cut in the bay. And
Yeah.
it is the art of the process, I suppose, or one of the parts of the art of the process. So.
Yeah. And that's why we like doing casts like this, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, for sure.
I mean, this is us getting. I mean, I always wanted to. I've produced commentaries before, but I've never got to do one. And this is always my way of. This is what I do instead.
Yeah, yeah.
Is this sort of thing. But that doesn't change the fact that this is a criminally underserved film on home video and deserves extras. It deserves documentaries. It deserves, interviews. If they can't get a commentary, this is a film that. The more we do it, the more I'm like, why doesn't this have? Why isn't this? This has got a special edition, and it needs one. It really does need one.
I'll give you. I have a little bit about the line where he says, um, he kind of, they're having their discussion about his legal obligations and whatnot, and Martin says he just wants to work through it, and then he sort of leans back and gets into a posture, could be dark and sinister, could be kind of trying to tell a joke when he says, "I know where you live," and right, like he later on reveals that. He says it as a joke, but it's delivered as one of those things that like could go either way depending on how you react to it, kind of thing. But I think that moment leads to the most healthy discussion that they've had so far, in our time with them as a patient and psychologist. So except that it's less like therapy for Martin, it's more like couples therapy for them. After he says that, so
I mean, there's a lot of this scene which reinforces that father-child dynamic, with, I think, in some ways, Dr. Altman coaching Martin through what it means to be psychiatry. The explanation of this fear being an emotional involvement, and as you said, that wasn't a nice thing to say. That wasn't designed to make me feel good.
Yeah,
It's almost like he's kind of berating his child in a way, and I think because Martin thinks of this relationship somewhat in that manner, it's part of why he actually does follow what Altman advises in the rest of the film, by and large.
Yep, no, that makes sense. That really does. Wow, there was one other thing I just remembered. Brain. Oh yes, you were talking about the description of what the Doctor was supposed to look like on the page.
Yes.
Is it me, or does that sound not just particularly 1970s, but does it sound not a million miles away from a Clint Eastwood style cowboy? Rough shirt, sheepskin jacket, old fire boots. I'm just wondering if they kind of had this visualization of like one era's, killer or star. Eastwood was for so long a certain type of masculinity on screen and a certain type of killer on screen, and I just wonder if there was a visual joke they'd planned there that ended up not happening.
You could be right, actually. I'd been thinking of it slightly differently, more like this kind of weird, lumberjacky kind of vibe.
Oh, okay, yeah. Like
which also doesn't
Man.
really make a lot of sense, if I'm honest. But like the Kris Kringle vibe and the sheepskin jacket, it's almost like the grandfather in the log cabin.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
The crunchy hippie kind of.
Yeah. But it's just such a weird description.
Again, very Twin Peaks. Dr. Jacoby's character with his the Hawaiian shirt and the beard and all of that. Except now we're switching it out. Yeah. Again, I think I don't think we can ever underestimate the shadows that Twin Peaks throws over the 90s. In terms of what people think they can and can't write about, and how they can visualize things in a less than traditional manner.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
All right. Well, on that revelationary bombshell, this was minute 14 of Grosse Point Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your hosts, co-writers, and co-producers, myself, Dev Sodiger, and Hugh David.
Today's guest was David Forsyth. David, where can people find you online?
Come look, just search for Edge of Tomorrow and then include the word minute after that. You'll find us. If you leave off the minute, you get a lot of Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt, but throw on minute and you'll find us.
Fantastic, thank you. And you can find this podcast at all good podcast players, particularly the one I'm sure you were listening to us on, as well as on YouTube, X, if it's still around by the time you hear this, and Spotify. Handle for all of these is at Debi Radio, DEBI Radio, as well as on our website with the same debiradio.com, Debi Radio.
And you can also talk with us on the Facebook listeners group. That's Debi Radio 79.5 FM Fan Club.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time. It wasn't